Hey, Steve Stine from Guitar Zoom here. Thank you so much for joining me. This is Monday Guitar Motivation. Unfortunately, it's not live. I had to pre-record this as I had to be somewhere else today. But today what we're going to be doing is talking about bar chords and 3 ways to make that bar chord easier for you to play. And in order to do this, I actually have another camera set up back here so you can see what my elbow is doing as well. So when I think about bar chords, first of all, let's start off by talking about your arm angle. Now, if we think about like a D chord, and again, I'm going to switch to this other camera angle in just a second, but if we think about a D chord, for instance, we can see that the hand is at an angle like this, right? But if we wanted to play something like C, it would be very difficult to play it like this. It would be easier if we were able to bring the elbow in a little bit and turn the wrist this direction. Because in this situation, these fingers are on the bottom. But when we turn to a C, those fingers now all of a sudden have to move toward the top of the guitar. So when we're thinking about bar chords, there's 3 things I always think about. Number 1, the strength at which you're squeezing that chord onto the fretboard. The second thing is your wrist placement. And then the third thing is your elbow placement. Now, when you're doing this, what I want you to think about is how you're sitting as well. For instance, you can't really see it, but this leg is actually elevated a little bit, which brings the guitar up a little bit. The second thing is when I go to play, as I use my elbow right here against the back of the guitar, I tend to brace it a little bit, which pushes the guitar neck out a little bit. So I'm not playing straight across my guitar, and if you've heard me talk about chords, you've heard me talk about this before anyway, but basically, if I put the guitar straight across my guitar, what that means is this elbow is going to have to be out here, and this elbow is going to have to be back here. If I sort of brace that in and squeeze that guitar in a little bit like this, what it does is it allows my elbow here to be in a natural position, and then therefore this elbow as well is in a more natural position, and it's got room here where my stomach is to move a little bit. Okay? Now everybody's different, but the reason I talk about this is because when I was first learning how to play bar chords, I struggled far more than any of my students ever have. I couldn't get them. I couldn't get them to work. And I tried and I tried, and then all of a sudden it started making sense to me. But what I started realizing is I had to sort of morph myself around the guitar neck to figure out how to make this to work best. Now, the last thing I want to say before I show you this is also be aware that an electric guitar is probably going to be easier than an acoustic guitar when you're practicing these things. And really simply because the string thickness is going to make a difference as well. If you have really, really thick strings and let's say your strings are further away from the guitar neck, it's harder to play bar chords. If your strings are a little bit closer, maybe the strings are a little bit thinner, and an acoustic guitar will work just fine, don't get me wrong. But think about that. Think about the thickness of the strings that you have on there and maybe how far away they are. Again, when I was learning how to play when I was younger, I had a guitar where the strings were probably about that far away from the neck, and it was very, very difficult to pull those strings back to get to the fretboard, where now a lot of times, guitars are much, much easier to play these days. So anyway, let's break down these 3 components. So with a bar chord, what I'm going to be doing is using the E major chord. I'm going to move that up and make it into a bar chord. So first thing I want to think about when I'm doing this is as I've made that bar chord, again, you need to know what a bar chord is, and you can always watch one of my other videos to find that out. But once I've made this bar chord, what I want to think about is this, and all 3 of these things work in conjunction with each other. But if I'm approaching the guitar from this angle, think about how, first of all, this finger isn't really sitting in one fret like it's supposed to. And these fingers are at a severe disadvantage because they're all the way down here. So if I could turn that elbow in, it's going to make it easier because these fingers are going to move up, okay? And it's also going to put my first finger in a better placement, okay? And in order to do that, I need to think about my wrist as well. A lot of times when people play guitar, they do this. When you're doing bar chords, what you really want to think about is lowering that wrist down a little bit. Now, I'm going to switch camera angles here, and I'm going to show you both this and my elbow so you got a better idea how this works, okay? All right, so here we are. What I want you to think about is if my wrist was up like this, it would be hard to be able to reach those. But if I can move my wrist down a little bit so the thumb is more in this position. Now again, your thumb might be up here a little bit, it might be down here a little bit, it depends on your hand size, all sorts of different things. But what I want you to think about is with the wrist down, I can move those fingers more. When the wrist is up, I don't have as much movement in my fingers. So I'm going to move that down. Now, this is the big thing I want to show you is my elbow. If I was sitting at an angle like this, like I was showing you before to play a D chord, okay, my elbow is sitting way out here. Okay, and now my wrist is sitting at this position. If I can keep my wrist down a little bit and move that elbow in, you see, I'm moving that elbow toward my stomach a little bit. That's going to straighten out this first finger as opposed to being out here. So with the combination of my wrist being in a bit more of a downward position with my thumb back here, now I can straighten these out a little bit, and my elbow in a little bit, it's going to straighten all of that out. Now I could even move my elbow in further if I needed to, which is going to turn the wrist even more this direction, which I'm going to show you when I go back to the other angle. Okay? But think about that. So my wrist is down, my elbow is not sitting out here, my elbow is down here, and I could even move that elbow in a little bit this direction. All right, so now we're back. So my elbow is down as I showed you, my wrist is down, and when I do that, again, you can see what happens with that first finger and those other fingers as I move. So it's a simple idea, but it really is effective. So if I keep that down a little bit, have my wrist down a little bit. Now, here's the thing. When I'm in this position, when I first started learning to play bar chords, what I was thinking was I had to be at an angle like this. Like my teacher told me, play with my first finger like this. Well, the problem is when I tried to play with my first finger straight across like this, again, it moves that elbow out here. And the second thing is if you look at your finger, it isn't really straight anyway. Where the knuckles are, it's not really straight anyway. So what I started learning is if I kind of thought about, and again, this is an adjustment that you have to make, but if I kind of thought about using the side of the finger a little bit, that way, if I was even turned just a little bit this direction with the joints of my finger or the knuckles of my finger, I could still be pressing on those strings. And then, of course, you've got these three fingers or however many fingers you're using for your bar chord. Maybe you're making a minor bar chord or something. But those are covering up frets in front of that bar, right? So when I go to make this, if I kind of think about, instead of being straight on like this, trying to press down, if I turn my elbow in and kind of play with my finger just at a little bit of an angle, I can still get the sounds that I'm looking for. And always remember, when it comes to chords, scales, anything that you're doing, the closer that you can get to that oncoming fret wire without actually getting on top of it, the less pressure you have to use. So as I'm pressing right here, I can't really get my other fingers out of the way, but it looks like I'm sitting right on top of that fret, but I'm not. I'm right behind it. And again, my fingers curl just a little bit as opposed to being straight across like this, which again is jutting my elbow out this direction. I want my elbow in a little bit. Okay, so my finger is now kind of comfortable, and therefore, because of the placement of my wrist and the placement of my elbow, I don't have to press as hard to get the sound that I'm looking for. Now, there's no doubt that if you were sitting here right now playing this guitar, you would recognize that it's very easy to play. I've got fairly light strings on there. It's set up quite low to the fretboard the way I like to play, and so you'd press down and you'd think, oh, that's easier to play. And that does make a difference. I'm not saying you should do that. I'm just telling you that it really does make a difference. So that's what you want to start off doing, is think about where your wrist placement is. Think about where your elbow placement is. Think about not pressing so hard, but actually maybe just curling just a little bit to try and find a nice, comfortable place to be. Now, when you're practicing, if you practice, for instance, at the 1st fret, it's going to feel different than it does if you practice at the 7th fret. Because again, your elbow, when you're over here, your elbow's got to reach out a little bit. When you move to the 7th fret, now the elbow is moving in toward the stomach a bit more. So be aware that when you're practicing these bar chords, that it might be easier for you to practice at the 5th or 7th fret or something, or it might be easier for you to practice at the 1st fret. The point being is figure that out, and don't just put yourself in a situation where you're practicing the hardest thing because you feel like that's what you're supposed to be doing. Figure out the way to do it the easiest way to make the best sound, and then start shifting around to try and figure out how to do it in more of those problem spots. Okay, so hopefully that helps you a little bit in better understanding how to approach making that bar chord. Think about your wrist placement, your elbow placement, okay, and your finger placement, and certainly the strength at which you're squeezing that chord onto the fingerboard. And then also remember, if you grab on a little bit and kind of pull in with the back of that neck a little bit, or the back of the body a little bit, it'll push that neck out and give you a little more room. Sometimes I get students where, their stomach might be a little bit bigger than mine or something like that. No offense at all, it's perfectly fine. But if you find you don't have a lot of room here to try and move in, you might want to move that guitar neck out just a little bit to make it a little bit easier. We're all built differently, and what we need to do is figure out what works best for us, all right? So take care, stay positive, keep practicing. Check out guitarzoom.com for guitar courses. We have an all-access membership now that you can check out as well. And just keep practicing, and hopefully this will help you a little bit for this week for something new to work on to make this a little bit easier. All right, take care.